Thanks, Sophie. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And Sophie's right, I am going to talk about a very difficult and painful area. I've given this 3 titles to try and capture the 3 themes. We're really only focusing on the first one, where parents, in the context of a high conflict separation divorce, usually, but not always, focus upon each other rather than upon their children. And one parent may deliberately rupture the bond between a formerly loving parent and their child. Some of those parents never see their children again. They're not dead, but that relationship has ended or ruptured, sometimes irretrievably. And children, of course, have their own reasons for hating parents. How many of you have teenagers? Okay, I think you might know what I mean. Okay, so when a parent exploits that particular ambivalence in a teenager, or their natural rebellion, or their natural oppositional behaviour, it gets a little bit more insidious and deliberate. There's something I call the X factor, which occurs in a step-family context. Step-family is also known as blended families, or for some of you who've been in them, curdled families. Or does that ring a bell? Yes. Or the Germans, I think, have in my view, a more accurate name called patchwork families. And very often what step-families have to work with is not just bringing together children who just don't want to be there, but the influence of a hostile ex-partner or partners interfering in the relationship, usually in the context of complex shared care arrangements. I should also declare that I have personal experience in this area. It's not just the clients I work with, I am one of them. So what are we talking about? I've put together some very simple definitions so we understand what we're dealing with here. And the point I want to make here is that what I call parental alienation is a systematic approach by one parent to destroy a relationship between another parent, the other parent, and their child or children. And it's a set of behaviours, acts, omissions that together make up a system. And it is actually quite systematic. It's not just a random sort of accidental thing. There is a class of parents who do this, and I think we call them naive. I think we've all done it at times with our children, you know. Oh, your mother's always talking with her friends on the phone, she's not interested in you. Well, he's always working so hard, he hasn't got time to spend with you. Many parents will have done things like that. It's naive, it's innocent, and it's not particularly harmful in the context of a loving relationship. Okay? But when it's done with a different intent, it falls into a system and a process, and we'll talk about what that is. There is something called hostile aggressive parenting, which is not really an official term, but it's perhaps best described as a form of parenting where, while we parent you as the child, we're not really interested in you. I'm interested in using you to get to the other parent. Those of you who know your Greek mythology will know the story of Medea, who kills her children to punish her errant husband, Jason. And unfortunately, that is no myth. This actually does kill children. And there have been 2 fairly recent cases in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, where a father threw his 4-year-old daughter off the Westgate Bridge, again in the context of a high conflict separation and divorce. We don't know the truth of that as to what was going on there, other than he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. And another parent drove their car into the dam and drowned their children in the car. Again, we'll never quite know the truth of that, but he's spending the rest of his life in jail as well. So make no mistake, this is actually quite serious. So what sort of things do parents do? Okay. Imagine what it might be like for a child, and again, it's all age and stage appropriate, to hear their parent, their mother or their father, telling them what a bad person the other parent is. They've just separated. It's bad enough as it is for the child. They don't quite know where they stand anymore, who's focusing on them. To hear a parent saying to them, your mother is really bad, she's evil, she's done horrible things. Or your dad isn't paying child support, we're poor, we're going to have to sell the house. Okay? The devaluing, one of the worst ways of devaluing a parent in the eyes of a child is to no longer refer to them as a parent. Now, in my situation, and I'll use this as a personal example, I stopped being dad. I was called Stan. Now, imagine what that does for a child's conception of a parent. All of a sudden, our role as a parent is eliminated. We're totally devalued and disenfranchised in the lives of our child in the role that we have. That can be very damaging. Not only that, there is another form where a child overhears a parent speaking on the phone or to a third party about how awful the other parent is in the context of divorce, separation or whatever. Now, it's normal at one level for parents to do that, to feel really bad and angry with the other parent because of all the things that have happened in the relationship. It's when it's done deliberately, knowing full well that the child is in hearing distance of this. And this kind of indirect denigration is actually more powerful than the in-your-face kind. It carries with it a different kind of authority. How many of you have photographs of yourself with your child? Yep, okay. Imagine if you separated from your partner and you received that photograph with your picture cut out. Okay, that's the sort of thing that parents who are alienated often receive from the other parent. It's quite a deliberate and powerful message to say, you are not part of my child's life anymore. The other thing too is the changing or reinterpretation of memories and history with the other parent. Oh, your father or your mother never taught you to ride a bicycle. They taught you how to fall off. You remember when you injured yourself? So we start focusing on negative experiences of memories which were formerly good. This is quite a dangerous one. In the context of shared care in Australia anyway, a child is often, in these situations, placed in what I call a loyalty conflict. They can't be disloyal to both parents. They love both parents equally. But when they're with one, they can't show that parent that they love the other one. And when they're with that parent, they can't show the parent they used to be with that they love that one as well. What if one parent actively manipulates that situation and basically sets up a case of conditional love? Well, you can't be with me if you love your father or your mother. And the implicit message is you must choose. So children are forced into that situation of, if I want to be loved by that parent, I have to love them their way. And often that their way means they must lose the relationship between them and the other parent. Often the only way they can live with that internally is to then demonise that other parent, to create almost a false story to justify why they can't be with that parent. This often results in sort of gross exaggerations of what we now call the alienated parent's capabilities. Apparently, some parents have superhuman capabilities in this. They have the capacity to change people. That's what some children will say. So this demotion and devaluing, like I said, involves reducing a parent to first name status or not referring to them at all. In other words, they're cut out by omission. So in letters and communications with parents, one parent will not refer to the other at all. It's like you don't exist. So the child gets a very powerful message, implicit message, the other parent does not exist, and there's now an implicit sanction if I mention that parent again. This is probably one of the most popular forms of alienation because it's so easy. And it's easy by showing up late to child pickups, rearranging child pickups and then not showing up to that particular place but showing up to the previous one. So the stories I've heard from my parents are endless about the innovations in sabotaging shared care. And the other popular way, for example, is when one parent is spending time with their child and that child receives an endless barrage of mobile phone calls from the other parent. Thank you. Pretty soon it just gets too hard. There's just so many different ways of displacing anger and hurt. All of this fits into a process, a system. Forces the child to resolve a conflict that they shouldn't be in the first place. A loyalty conflict with a parent who loves them. And so once you create the loyalty conflict and you force the child to resolve that conflict, you're then in a position to alienate the child. That's what alienating parents do. And they eventually support the child in making exaggerated claims about what the alienated parent supposedly did to them. When you ask the child, well, can you give me an example of what happened? They often cannot do so. When they are at the age of stage when they could reasonably have a memory of what that supposedly was. So in Australia anyway, this then sets a status quo that parents then enforce through our legal system. And of course that's when parents come to see me, when the damage is already done. So by the time, I'm working with a parent now who has a 15-year-old daughter, and he lost contact with that daughter. It's quite complicated, but it's part of it was the teenage oppositional behaviour, and part of it was that the other parent manipulated that behaviour to get that child to live with them on the promise that they would get from them what the other parent wasn't going to give. They weren't going to give it because that was actually good parenting. Okay? Now we have to work with that in the context of this alienation situation. How do you know? This is the tricky one. How do you know a child is actually alienated? Because some of the reasons why a child may alienate themselves is because they've been abused. And it's quite dangerous to mistake that. If a child has been sexually abused, for example, they will hate their abuser. They may also love their abuser too. Okay? The big one for me is children using concepts beyond their age and stage of understanding. That's a dead giveaway. Or if they make claims that the alienated parent has done something to them that they then cannot justify. They haven't got a memory of it. They can't rationalise it. And usually, if that's the case, they've been told to say that. And yes, that's what happens when they start parroting that sort of mantra. So, how do we work with this? Well, the bottom line says it all. The only real option for a target parent is to take the moral high ground, to be as little like the other parent as possible. The parents who come to see me are either in the depths of despair because they've lost contact with their child, or they are enraged and they want to go on a campaign, to hold everyone accountable. Sorts of discussions I have with them is saying, well, how would this help you get your relationship back with your child? How did your child get you back in their lives? So I have this concept that I work with called being strategically empathic and empathically strategic. Because when you're working with parents in this mode, and this is who I work with, I have not worked with children as yet, you have to work with that parent They have to have an understanding, an empathic understanding of what's happening for their child in this situation and to not make it worse for the child. They have to also understand what may be motivating the alienating parent. In other words, what I call know your enemy. And they have to tailor their approach for the type of person who's doing this. They have to also know when not to work with the other parent, because sometimes that's a trap. You get seduced into a trap to repeat the performance. So in one particular case, I was working with a parent who, as I say, lost contact with their daughter. And by subtly changing his form of communication with his daughter, mindful of how the other parent was working on the daughter, his daughter actually sought him out. Okay? The moment he was trying to plead with the daughter, you know, why can't we be together again? Or why can't you come back into my life and I be in your life? It played into the other parent's hands. But when he started working with the daughter saying, well, you've made a very adult decision here to go and live with your mother, and I support you in that sort of bid for your independence. I'm here for you. She sought him out. He couldn't do that until he'd worked through his trauma around losing contact, until he had that empathic understanding of what might be happening for his daughter. So I think Marcus Aurelius summed it up. Everything comes down to that. So perhaps what I should say is that this presentation is a very small part of a much larger one that I have on my website for parents who seek me out. The reason why I do that is that they struggle to locate their experience. They do not understand how this happened. And so the first thing we try and do and say, well, what is the system or process that happened for you and your child? The moment they start to understand that, they then have an appreciation of what they can do about it. They then start being strategic. They actually then start being parents. They also learn that the high road can also be the hard road. But that's what parenting is about at the end of the day. We're not necessarily there to be liked, we're there to be respected. But in this process, too many parents lose the respect of their children. And just so you know, I didn't make this up. This is where I got it from. So this is quite a bit researched in the Northern Hemisphere. Perhaps I would emphasise the work of Lowenstein, Baker and Warshak. Gardner was the man who originally formulated this in the 1980s, and he remains a controversial figure in terms of his work. Is routinely criticised and receives accolades all at the same time. This is a very disenfranchising experience for the parents I work with, because their experience is that very few practitioners actually get their experience. And often the ways of working are counterproductive and counterintuitive.